Question is that Part 4 stand part, but before we do, we have two amendments. The first amendment in the name of Moana Maki, that's amendment to omit part is out of order as being a direct negative under Speaker's Rulings 111(4). We now come to the second amendment in the name of Moana Maki. This is a typescript amendment to new section 277A. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary will say no. The noes have it. Party vote. I'll ask the clerk for a party vote.
New Zealand National.
58 votes opposed.
New Zealand Labour.
42 votes in favour.
Green Party.
9 votes in favour.
Act New Zealand.
5 votes opposed.
Maori Party.
Toko toru e whakaheana.
Progressive.
1 vote in favour.
United Future.
1 vote opposed.
Members, the ayes are 52, the noes are 67. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now is that Part 4 stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary will say no. The ayes have it. Party vote. I'll ask the clerk for a party vote.
New Zealand National.
58 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
42 votes opposed.
Green Party.
9 votes opposed.
Act New Zealand.
5 votes in favour.
Maori Party.
Toko toru e tautoko ana.
Progressive.
1 vote opposed.
United Future.
1 vote in favour.
Members, the ayes are 67, the noes are 52. Part 4 will stand part. The question now is that the schedule stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary will say no. The ayes have it. We now come to clauses 1 and 2. The question is that clause 1 stand part. The Honourable, Moana Maki.
That's quite all right. I will forgive you for that slip up, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to stand and take a call. And of course, Labour will be supporting this infrastructure bill. We're disappointed, of course, that we were not able to appeal to the government's sense of social responsibility when it came to Part 4. But certainly we support the bill as it comes. And I think members perhaps have some alternative titles that they may consider appropriate for this piece of legislation, because now we've had the debates on the different parts and we've seen the layout of the infrastructure bill, and I think now it would be timely, Mr. Chair, to rename this piece of legislation no longer the infrastructure bill, but the infrastructure, and then in brackets, housing is not infrastructure, close brackets, bill, because clearly this government does not think that housing is infrastructure, and we're being told that the purpose of this piece of legislation is to support infrastructure development, is to align the different needs of the different utility operators. And in fact, in the House today, Mr. Jerry Brownlee stood up and told us that we didn't even need the infrastructure bill at all. He didn't think it needed to be progressed rapidly because he thought he was doing such a fabulous job on infrastructure. I would point out to the Minister and the Chair that his holiday highway, helping himself get to his holiday home, is not going to be addressing issues of housing in New Zealand. So I think it's only right that this bill be renamed the Infrastructure Housing is Not Infrastructure Bill. And if you look at Australia, exactly the opposite is happening. In Australia, they see housing as an integral part of any infrastructure package. And during their of course, Australia managed to keep themselves out of recession, and one of the things they did was they invested heavily in social housing, and they are continuing to do so. And if we want to keep looking at the areas where the gap between New Zealand and Australia is widening under this national government, commitment to social and affordable housing has to be one of the biggest areas. So perhaps another name for this bill could be the infrastructure. The National Act Māori Party government doesn't care about affordable housing anymore bill. Because what was clear in Part 4, when no one from the government stood up today to defend their decision to repeal affordable housing legislation, is that affordable housing is off the agenda for this government. Because all we've seen since they've come into government, we've seen a lot of theatrics. We've seen a lot of song and dance routines on the other side of the House from the Housing Minister, Phil Heatley. If pantomime could build houses, then housing supply would not be a problem in New Zealand. But unfortunately, pantomime cannot build houses, and this government has shown no commitment. Because what have they done, Mr Chair? Well, they've gotten rid of the shared equity pilot. Well, this shared equity is a scheme which is an integral part of any affordable housing policy everywhere else in the world. And it's gone, Mr Chair. It's gone. There was a 2-year pilot. 20 months of that 24-month pilot was under this national government, and what did they do? They told Housing New Zealand to stop promoting it. And then at the end of the 2-year pilot, they said, well, we're not going to continue funding it because there was a really low uptake. Well, there was a really low uptake because no one knew it existed, which raises the other question of what is the point of spending money on a pilot that no one knows about? That is a huge waste of money, and I'll tell you the answer to that. It was so that they could claim they were doing something about affordable housing, so they could claim that they were taking shared equity as an option seriously, when we know that they weren't. And we were just very lucky that an honest Housing New Zealand staff member came out and said we were told to stop promoting it. Well, guess what? That staff member probably had to apologise to Housing Minister Phil Heatley, just like the Housing New Zealand staff who went to the Select Committee on the RMA reforms and said this will do nothing for affordable housing. They got dragged in and had to apologise to Phil Heatley for being honest to the Select Committee. And which comes to my second point, I think, which is we could also call this the infrastructure, in brackets, the National Party think tax cuts and RMA reform are going to fix everything bill. And I want to draw attention, I didn't get to do this in Part 4 because I ran out of speaking slots, Mr Chair, but I want to bring members' attention to advice that we had from officials on this part of the legislation, which pointed out that the government had announced a 2-phase review of the RMA. They said that Phase 2 of the RMA would indeed, or might consider a range of options for land supply, but that it would do nothing to address affordable housing. Affordable housing measures were not being considered as part of the RMA 2-phase review. So when the government gets up and says that they're going to fix affordable housing by tax cuts, number one, and number two, by RMA reforms, what they're not telling the public is that, in fact, housing affordability is playing no part, Mr Chair. Thank you, Mr Chair. That housing affordability is playing no part of those RMA reforms. Now, the second part of this infrastructure, in brackets, National Act Māori Party think tax cuts and RMA reform are going to fix everything bill, is the tax cuts part. Because Housing Minister Phil Heatley said tax cuts are National's #1 policy for affordable housing. So let's investigate that a little bit further. Because someone on the minimum wage is getting $3 a week in tax cuts. $3 a week. Now, the Finance Minister tells us that that's going to compensate for increases in GST. Of course, what he doesn't mention is that people on those incomes, this is the bill around the government's infrastructure, in brackets, tax cuts and RMA reforms are going to fix everything bill. He's telling us it's going to compensate for GST. Of course, these people spend all of their income on things that attract GST pretty much, so they're going to be, it's very regressive, they're going to be more greatly impacted. It's also meant to cover off cost of inflation, any rent increases. All this is going to be covered by this $3 a week, and apparently it's also going to fix housing affordability. Well, you'd have to be a pretty good budgeter to stretch $3 a week that far. Sorry, not you, Mr Chair. New Zealand families would have to be pretty good at budgeting to spread $3 a week that far. It just isn't going to happen. And once again, this comes back to the central point of this infrastructure, in brackets, the National Party thinks that tax cuts and RMA reform are going to fix everything bill, which is that they're not. And every single piece of international evidence, Mr Chair, tells you that you need a mix of policies to help address housing and affordability, because there are a whole range of different things that cause housing inaffordability. And, land supply is one. Certainly regulatory reform, making sure that it's cheaper and easier to build homes is another. There are a whole range of wages, incomes, incredibly important when it comes to housing and affordability. So no one is claiming that there is a silver bullet.